Welcome back to Horror Writers Fest. Welcome as everyone filters in. If you can see and hear me, drop your location in the chat so we can see where you are joining us from. And I will drop some links for you. Hello from California, the Netherlands, Seattle, Scotland, the UK. It looks like everyone can see and hear me just fine. So welcome back to another session in Horror Writers Fest Day 1. I'm Michelle with Pro Writing Aid, and we are so happy to have you back with us. Just to go over a few quick announcements first, and then we will jump right into our session with Hannah. So first off, to access your replays, you will want to go to the hub page. It is in the links here that I'm dropping for you. This is where you can find your session resources, any offers, your replays. They will be uploaded as soon as they are done processing between Zoom and YouTube. The time can vary, so if you just refresh throughout the day, you should see them all popping up there. And these replays will also be moving to our community page by November 1st in the event recording space so that you can watch them indefinitely there. As a thank you for joining us for Horror Writers Fest, we do have a special offer for you, and that is exclusive early access to our Black Friday sale. This is our largest sale of the year where you can get 50% off both premium and premium pro plans for yearly and lifetime. And this, like I said, is our biggest sale of the year. So if you would like to take advantage of that, you will receive an email with the information to access the sale. If for some reason you don't receive anything by November 16th, please get a hold of us at hello@prowritingaid.com, and we will be happy to pass along the info to you. If you would like to keep talking about horror writing and just writing in general, we'd love to have you in our private online writing community. Joining is very simple. You just log in with your Pro Writing Aid account information. It lets you write in. It's free to join, and you can go to the live event chat to talk to other attendees. You can see the event recordings from previous writers' events in our event recording space, and we will be planning some more fun things there. So we'd love to have you join. If you would like to provide your feedback for what you thought of Horror Writers Fest this week, we would love to have you provide that in a very brief survey. I'm going to link that again in the chat now. Keep that link handy. I know that it's early on in the event, but we would appreciate it if you could provide your feedback tomorrow or later on this week at some point after you've gotten a chance to see everything. Tell us what you loved, what you think we could improve upon, and what you'd love to see in a future event, because your feedback is super important for our future event planning, and we really appreciate you taking the time to do that. Lastly, we have a fun new writing challenge that is starting very soon, November 4th through the 8th. It's called 5K in 5 days. This is a brand new writing challenge we are hosting in our community where participants will write 5,000 words or more in 5 days. This is going to have live write-ins with members of the Pro Writing Aid staff who are also participating in the challenge, because we do have a lot of writers here on our team. And there will be daily teachings, discussion forums, prompts, and different things like that to kind of boost your inspiration. So we would love to have you, whether you are just starting out or you are working on a project that's been in progress for a while. You're welcome. Writers of all genres, every stage of the journey are welcome to come. Please sign up using the link in the chat, and it is also on the hub page for you. Reminders for our session today, please use the Q&A box if you have any questions for our speaker. If you have a question about your account, please refer to hello@prowritingaid.com. If you would like to chat with other attendees today, please use the chat to do that. But you'll want to select everyone in the drop-down menu beside 2. Otherwise, your messages will not be visible to anyone but the host and panelist. And as a reminder, any special links that are being dropped in the chat will also be on the hub page for you today as well. So I am so excited to introduce our speaker. Hannah Kate Kelley is a developmental editor and author accelerator certified book coach, helping fiction writers write, revise, and launch their stories. She lives in New York City with her partner, and for more writing resources, you can head over to her website, which is kelleyeditorial.com. and that is in the chat for you, and I will drop that intermittently throughout our session today. But welcome, Hannah. We're so happy to have you back with us for another event.
Thank you, and hello everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for the deck. Okay, we got Canva. There we go. Okay, hopefully you can see everything. And I'm going to go ahead. Oops, I already lost my screen. Okay. All right, everybody. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to stop my video so you can just see the screen here. And hello, thank you so much, Michelle, for having me back and the Pro Writing Aid team. I am really excited to be here today and talk about one of my favorite subgenres, the Gothic story. So without further ado, let's jump in. This is how to outline a Gothic novel. And moving along. Okay, so by the end of this class, I hope that you'll have added these 3 things to your story writing arsenal. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the Gothic story, where it came from, and then we're going to get into the 9 genre conventions and characteristics of Gothic fiction. And then we're going to talk about how to outline your own Gothic novel using the 3-act structure and breaking down each plot point for your own story. And alongside that, we're going to be looking at 2 different Gothic novel examples to see how they break down their own outlines. So again, hello, everybody. I'm Hannah. I'm a developmental editor and a book coach. If you are not familiar with what developmental editing is, I'll just explain. This is someone you go to when you are ready to polish your story, whether you're trying to self-publish or you're trying to publish traditionally. And we help writers with high-level items like outlining and structure for your story. And also we work with things like character development, pacing, tone, all that good stuff. A little bit about me is, as Michelle mentioned, I live in New York City with my partner. Also, I have a little experience here that I've listed of my background working at publishing houses and a few magazines, and also where I'm a guest editor and a guest writer on a few places in the writing world. So I wanted to kick things off by starting with my favorite Gothic story. If I had to choose one, I'd probably say it's this book, short story, The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. This was written in 1892, and it's a feminist psychological horror story about this woman's descent into madness while she's trapped in this haunted house. It's exciting, it's creepy. I would recommend it if you have not read it yet. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about Gothic fiction, what it is and where it came from and why it's still so popular today. So what is a Gothic story? Well, it's also called a Gothic horror story because it's also called Gothic horror because it is a subgenre of the horror genre and a subgenre of romantic literature, which came out of the end of the 18th century. There are 3 big things I think that pop up when you're thinking about a Gothic story. The first one is that there are these hauntingly massive, dilapidated settings, right? So like an ancient medieval castle or a mansion, perhaps, is something that comes to mind. Also, there's a lot of suspenseful narrative devices that Gothic writers like to use, such as foreshadowing, symbolism, plot twists, and also unreliable narrators are really big in Gothic fiction. And then lastly, they love to explore dark themes. So these will be like oppression, morality, themes of guilt, insanity, and also love, or like the dark side of love. And next I want to talk about horror fiction in general versus Gothic fiction. So again, Gothic fiction is like this subset of horror, and I think it differs from your classic horror story in a few big ways. So if you're thinking of like a slasher book or a slasher film, for example, it's probably going to be a little more direct. You have this very visceral body fear when you're reading through it or watching it. There's going to be faster pacing, and then the ending is typically going to be a little bit more clear cut and clean, where you know, okay, the protagonists have defeated the villain or they have defeated the villain for now. Whereas Gothic fiction is a little more ambiguous. There's more subtlety here. And instead of such a fast pacing like you'd see in a slasher movie or in a book, there's going to be more of a creeping dread associated with these stories instead. And the endings also usually are going to be left a little bit ambiguous as well. Like we may have the main thread of the story tied up, but there might be still some threads loose, and writers are left with this like gut-wrenching feeling. I have pulled a few examples here of some Gothic fiction stories. Hopefully you are familiar with a lot of these titles. I also spent a long time finding the prettiest versions of all these book covers, which just happened to be a lot of red here, which happened to me the last time I presented for Sci-Fi Week. So anyway, you might be familiar with a more modern story like The Shining by Stephen King up here on the left, and also probably an older classic like Dracula by Bram Stoker. Today, we're going to be talking about these two examples in more depth. So I've pulled a classic Gothic story and also a more modern one, so we can look at both. Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte was written in 1847. This is primarily a love story. And then on the right here, we have Mexican Gothic, written by Silivia Moreno-Garcia. This is written in 2020. It takes place in 1950s Mexico, though. So this is a historical novel, but it was written very recently. And I'm excited to look at both of these two side by side. Mexican Gothic has a romance subplot, but the main plot here is escaping the evil of the mansion that the protagonist has found herself in. Next, I want to talk a little bit about Gothic fiction, where it came from, and then we can understand a little bit better why it's still so popular today. Okay, so first up, the first ever book is said to be from Gothic fiction is said to be The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, and there's the cover right there. So there's a few interesting things to know about this story. First, the writer was a really interesting guy and very wealthy as well. He, at the time, was living in Europe in 1764, and he loved Gothic architecture. At the time, Gothic architecture was centuries old, so it was medieval, right? And they were bringing it back because they loved how dark and mysterious it was, even then, just how we feel about it now. He had a home called Strawberry Hill House, and he decided to have it all renovated in this style. So he got stained glass and like arch windows, the big castle-like turrets. And he, in true Gothic fashion, had this nightmare one night in his renovated home, which actually inspired the Castle of Otranto. The story, I won't spoil it for you, but you should know that it is full of supernatural prophecies, really strange, inexplicable events. There is an evil prince who is lusting after this virginal character, this woman, this damsel in distress, who is fleeing from him out of this medieval castle. There's battles in dark corridors, and there's plot twists as well. And this really set the genre tone and a lot of the characteristics for the genre we're going to cover later. Another thing to note here, and then I'll move on, is that in 1764, across Europe and other areas of the world, they were in an era of cultural, societal, religious upheaval that was just making all the people so afraid of all these changes going on. And so interestingly, they turned to horror. And we saw this with the pandemic recently too, is that a lot of people were also turning to horror stories. And they've done some studies on this, and they realized that people who read horror and consume horror media are actually more resilient in the face of fear than those who don't read horror, which I thought was kind of cool. Next up, we have the female Gothic era in which a few of these stories emerged, which you might be familiar with. So Jane Eyre, which we're going to talk about later. But basically, gone is the flat characters of the damsel in distress who is a victim, and now these women are writing stories with women protagonists who are complex characters, sometimes romances, sometimes not. Next, we have the Southern Gothic, which is kind of a subgenre of Gothic fiction itself. And this came out of the US, so it's written about the southern states of the US, and they explore the area's cultural and social issues like the haunting of slavery. And next we have the golden age of pulp fiction, which are these really fun book covers. These stories were kind of shorter, very lurid, very sensational, and readers like to pick these up when they wanted a quick thrill or shock value. And next we have the new Gothic romances. I absolutely love these book covers. They're so fun, so dramatic, just like the stories. So often there's going to be a heroine, a woman protagonist who is fleeing some threat, supernatural or otherwise. And lastly, we have our modern Gothic fiction. As I mentioned, we have Stephen King who wrote The Shining. It was nice to see how he brought the genre into the modern age by placing the story in a hotel rather than like a massive haunted mansion. I mean, they're very similar. And then also over here, we have Mexican Gothic on the right, and that is going to be one of the stories, as I mentioned, that we are going to get into a little bit later. Okay, so why is Gothic fiction still so popular today? I think for two big reasons. One, as I mentioned, it came out of an era of all this unrest, and I would say that we are also still in an era of major unrest. If you are living in the United States, as I see many of you are, and you are preparing for the upcoming presidential election, you will know that this feels very real. And then the second point I have here is that readers will probably always love horror stories, just like they did back then and just as they will in the future. And I'm excited to see where this subgenre is going to go. Okay, now we are going to talk about the genre conventions a little bit further. So why do I think it's so important to talk about this? Well, I think it's really vital that writers learn how to use conventions because you have to satisfy reader expectations. So let's say you're setting out to write yourself a Gothic novel and you give your story to a reader and they're like, wow, I loved it, but it was a cozy mystery, actually. I didn't think it was a Gothic novel. So you just want to know what readers are going to expect so that you can deliver. I've pulled the 9 tenets of Gothic fiction that I think are really important to the genre. We are going to go ahead and look at each one of these and see how they relate. Okay, so first up, I wrote the consolidation of past and present. So this is when the past starts to feel like this living, breathing thing that is being brought forward into the present. And so I put here that this often happens through spirits, apparitions, prophecies, curses, or even secrets from the family being brought forward. Interesting too to note is that there's usually a lot of unresolved cyclical trauma, cyclical family trauma that just keeps getting regurgitated time over time. And oftentimes, as we're going to see in Mexican Gothic, the protagonist has to come in and stop this cycle of trauma or danger or violence or whatever in order to, save the day. Next, we have the supernatural. I always think of Van Helsing. If you have seen that movie, it's very campy, very wonderful. Any type of creature from Van Helsing, like a vampire, some type of werewolf, or a Dr. and Jekyll, Mr. Hyde situation, that's going to be part of the creatures that Gothic fiction will explore. Also, other elements too, like ghosts and apparitions, perhaps like hearing a voice in the distance, or maybe sentient houses that have their own agency. These elements can be literal or symbolic. So you might have literally a vampire coming after your protagonist. Also, the vampire might represent something like the repressed sexuality of the protagonist. And then lastly, you can have two sources for your supernatural elements. Perhaps they'll be magical, so maybe like a witch has created a monster that is now wreaking havoc, or they might be grounded in scientific explanation. So like Frankenstein, for example, is created apparently by this scientist. We know, of course, that this is not possible. It's not very possible yet. So that means that they can both come from these different types of sources. And yes, it does kind of bridge into sci-fi if it's grounded in scientific explanation. Here we go. Next to dilapidated settings. Okay, so readers really like to read quite a little bit about your settings. So it's okay to lean into these and give a little more extensive description because they want to feel immersed. Also, the dilapidation is an important aspect of the settings because, again, we see the symbolism. This usually represents something like the societal decay or maybe even the decay of the character's mind as they start to lose their sanity over the course of the story. And lastly, I've included some examples here. These are mostly Western inspired Gothic settings. Of course, I'd love to see more non-Western settings as well. So we have the typical medieval Gothic castle, some underground passages running through it. Graveyards are a big one, cathedrals, vast oceans, creepy forests, and any other type of isolated space is good too. Next, we have the sublime, which you may have heard of. If you haven't, it's like an aesthetic or like a mashup of extreme emotions. So really intense emotions. And these are like suspense, terror, the macabre, disgust, shock, dread, awe, but also pleasure. So this is something that's going to be both terrifying, but also really amazing. If you're like, okay, what does that mean? A good example I like to give is if you've ever stood in front of the ocean before, you might have felt this feeling. So picture yourself all alone, standing in front of an ocean, stretching miles and miles around from you. Maybe it's dark or it's about to be dark, and there is just like this magnificent, deadly thing in front of you. Maybe the waves are crashing violently, but it's also incredible. It's beautiful, right? So this kind of mashup of feelings is something I think you should try to evoke in your own stories when it comes to the sublime. Next, we have these really important characters that came up in the first genre, in the first Gothic fiction stories, and I think are here to stay. And there's also some tropes that are being, turned around and recreated, which I like as well. So first up, we have the Byronic hero, also known as the anti-hero. This is someone who is going to be flawed, lonely, maybe they're going to be a lone wolf, bad boy type of character. And this is also a really popular character in romantasy stories. So if you've ever read like Fourth Wing or A Court of Thorns and Roses, then you know exactly what I'm talking about here. And next we have a tall, dark, and handsome monster. So back then, readers used to know pretty much right away who the villain was because they would be conventionally unattractive and therefore obvious to readers. So the genre did something new for them and gave them these really charming, wonderful, beautiful creatures who little by little exposed their true nature. And then down here at the bottom, we have the damsel in distress, classic trope and archetypal character. This is gonna historically be someone who was very pure, innocent. She was a victim, yes, often a woman, who was fleeing away from men and then being saved by men. And now we see this damsel in distress, obviously has agency now. This is no longer such a sexist trope. We're starting to move away from that, but writers do still like to play on this and these characters. Next, we have secrets, and I think there are these 4 types of secrets. So one character can keep a secret from another character. They can also keep secrets from themselves, so lying to themselves. Society can keep secrets from the individuals and then vice versa. So the individual can keep a secret from society. For example, perhaps they are keeping their sexuality a secret from their community. What does this mean? What kind of secrets can you have? Well, maybe you can have like concealed family ties, incest, sexual assault. Those are quite big actually in Gothic fiction. You can have buried events that are now coming to light, and you can have shape-shifting characters who begin to reveal their true nature slowly over time. A portent is a sign or warning that something terrible could happen. And often we see this with like an omen, a curse, a superstition, etc. And I put a crow here to remind myself, I think, we've heard before that if you see a certain amount of crows or ravens or a type of bird on a certain day in a certain number all at once, that it probably means something bad is going to happen to you. Next, we have romance. This usually isn't going to be a super feel-good, sappy romance like you might see in a contemporary romance novel. This is going to be more passionate and troubled than anything. So, and there are things threatening it. And oftentimes the protagonists themselves, as I mentioned, are going to be very morally complex people, and their love is going to be complicated as they work out their morality as well. And then I've also said that sometimes this little romance can be motivated by obsession, lust, and coercion. This gets a little bit into dark romance, which is its own subgenre of romance, but I would also say it's a subgenre of Gothic fiction as well. There's a lot in common here. If you haven't heard of dark romance, this is typically a love story between two or more people who centered around taboo content. There's usually going to be content warnings or trigger warnings. Anyway, just wanted to mention that as well. Moving along to the last point here, we have our dark themes again. So this is usually going to be showing what we bury into deep, deep, deep in our human psyche, but really it's just a part of our nature. So, guilt and shame that won't go away. Looking at vanity, like the picture of Dorian Gray, for example. Also, we have mortality, sexual repression, and good and evil. Those are some big ones. As I mentioned before, these themes are often used through symbolism and allegory, literary devices. Great. All right, we are about halfway through, and I'm just going to take a sip of water. Okay, awesome. So now we are going to move on to the Gothic novel outline. Okay, for the rest of this outline, we're going to be using something called the 3-act structure. Many of you have probably heard of this. If you have not, it's fairly simple, and that's why I love to use it. There are other outlines out there. For example, Save the Cat is a good one, but I wanted to choose something that was simple enough we could go over in this time slot, and I also recommend this to all of my readers, no matter writers, I'm sorry, no matter what genre they are writing, because it really does work for just about any genre. So here we have the first 3 acts, or sorry, the only 3 acts. The first act is recommended to be about a quarter of your story. This is just a guideline. You do not have to follow this to a T, but I just want to show you what is recommended. In Act 1, we're going to have the setup, we'll meet our protagonist, and then we're going to get into the inciting incident. Act 2 is the biggest act usually, and we get all the fun and game stuff happening now. We get to our midpoint where everything gets more serious, and then rising tension until we get to what seems like the hero's darkest hour at the end of Act 2. And lastly, in Act 3, we have the intense climax. Usually this is a big scene or a handful of scenes, and then we get our resolution. So we see what happens after. And again, this is probably going to be about a fourth of your story's length as well. I've broken down these plot points we're going to be looking at. You don't have to write any of this down. I'm going to be going through all of them. So Act 1 has 4 plot points. Act 2 also has 4 plot points we're going to look at. And then Act 3 has the final 3. Also, as we go along, you're going to see in blue here these percentage markers of when would be a good time for these plot points to happen in your story. Again, these are guidelines, these are not requirements, so I'm just including them in case you're getting stuck or you want to see if you're too far or too early on something. These could be helpful for you. All right. Now we're going to get into Act 1. I also want to mention that I have this freebie, which Michelle and or I are gonna drop in the chat. This is helpful. I think I created this for writers to help them make their outline no matter what genre they're writing in, and we're going to be following along the steps that I have here in this outline. So if you want a companion to this to create your own story, I do recommend downloading it later. All right, let's get started on Act 1. So we're going to go ahead and get into the hook. The hook I put here as the first plot point because I think it's really important, especially in stories today. The hook is something interesting. It just has to be interesting enough to draw in, or as we say, hook, the reader or the agent you're querying to, perhaps, before the inciting incident starts. This could be something like an interesting protagonist, perhaps like a very surprising first line. It could also be like an interesting or a creepy opening image. Also, it could be a conflict the protagonist has to solve, though this probably won't be the main conflict just yet because it probably won't be the inciting incident just yet, although it could be. This hook can come as early, as I said, as your first line, maybe the first paragraph, the first page, but probably it's going to fall somewhere into your first scene of your story. So let's look at our two examples now. First, we have the hook for Jane Eyre, and I'm going to go ahead and read this to you. So young Jane Eyre lives in an oppressive environment with her cruel, wealthy aunt and her cruel cousins. Readers are hooked by the intelligent, mistreated narrator and also getting hints of these supernatural forces when they stow her away in this red room for this horrible punishment. So already we're hooked by this interesting protagonist and we have questions in mind. We want to know what's going to happen with this room, with the supernatural forces, and what's going to happen with her awful aunt and cousins. Also on the right here, I'm including illustrations for each of these examples, and I just love this artist makes all of these artwork for Jane Eyre that are so lovely. So I've included her name at the bottom. Okay, moving on, we have the hook here for Mexican Gothic. Noemi Taboada is a glamorous playgirl, like a playboy, socialite in 1950s Mexico, and she gets summoned home from a costume party by her father's pressing news. She doesn't know yet what it is. Also, she's interesting. She smokes cigarettes, she toys with her boyfriends, she has a flippant, self-indulgent side, and readers again, are drawn in by this interesting protagonist, and they also have questions. They want to know what is so important that she has to go home. What does her father have to tell her? Next up, we have the setup, and this encompasses everything pretty much in the first act from the very start, so including the hook all the way up until your inciting incident. This is getting the reader ready to understand what the protagonist's ordinary world is like before it is interrupted by the inciting incident. And this can be a scene, it can be a series of scenes, it can be relatively short, it could be several chapters long. It depends on what your story needs. The protagonist at this stage, though, needs to be active. So they can't just be waiting around for life to finally happen to them. They need to be going and getting things and living their life, even if they haven't encountered the main conflict yet. So what does this look like? Well, here are some things you can write about in your own setup. So you could have an introduction to the protagonist's harrowing background, for example. You can showcase their greatest desires, fears, as well as their fatal flaw. Also, you can hint at the story's central theme, which will likely be related to this fatal flaw that they have. Also, you need to include important world building details so they understand how your world works before you go ahead and launch into the next act. And lastly, you want to make sure that you set the tone. Okay, so the setup for Jade Eyre is several chapters long. So as tension escalates with her cruel foster family, Jane is sent away to this disciplinary Lowood school, which you can see pictured as terrible over here on the right. She spends 8 years here. That's why we have so many chapters. A lot goes on, and she develops a strong sense of her morality and her values. And then at the very end, she becomes a governess. She is now set up after all these chapters and is ready to encounter the inciting incident, which is going to come up next. With Mexican Gothic, our setup looks a little bit different. There isn't that much setup needed for this story, so that's why the inciting incident actually happens in chapter 1, and we have a little tiny bit of setup here before we launch into the rest of the story. So readers learn that Noemi struggles with her impulsivity, both in love and in life in general. She wants to get her master's in anthropology, so a degree, and she loves to play the piano and is a popular socialite. Next up, we have the inciting incident. Again, this is at the 10 to 12% mark, but it can come earlier, it can come later. I'll talk about that in a second. So this is going to be a life-changing event for your protagonist. They either cannot go back to life as they know it, or it is going to be very difficult to ever go back to life as they know it. And this is going to be the first time your protagonist faces the primary antagonist, if there is a villain, a physical villain, or the conflict itself, whichever one you have in your story. As I said, this can come at the 10 to 12% mark, but it can also happen before then. It can also come a little bit after, though I would recommend not too far after. And it can also happen before your story even begins as part of the backstory. We see that sometimes. The inciting incident for Jane Eyre is depicted here on the right. So after completing her education at Lowood 8 years later, Jane accepts a governess position at the isolated Thornfield Hall, where she soon encounters the mysterious owner, Mr. Rochester. They meet here when he falls off his horse, and she helps him get back to Thornfield Hall, his home. I will say that if you're writing a romance, the moment the two lovers meet each other is almost always going to be the inciting incident in your story, and it is for Jane Eyre. Next, we have again this chapter 1 inciting incident in Mexican Gothic. So, Noemi's father receives a disturbing letter from her cousin Catalina claiming that her new husband Victor and his estate are killing Catalina. Noemi is obviously very concerned, but she has a bit of a debate here. She's choosing if she wants to go help her cousin or not. And then her father finally motivates her by saying, well, I will fund your anthropology degree if you go. So the inciting incident is she gets this letter and then promptly decides she is going to go to see if her cousin is okay at High Place. Next, we have the turning point. I call this the turning point because we are turning from one act into the other. So we're turning from Act 1 into Act 2. And in order to get to this point, to Act 2, the protagonist needs to commit to their story goal, or they need to step away. So it's kind of a big decision because we're reading this story and it's not going to end right here. Your protagonist is going to commit to their story goal. But before this point, they might be debating, what am I going to do? Or I know what I want to do, but how am I going to do it? They also might be dragging their feet. They really aren't ready. And now they are going to be ready. Okay, so the turning point here in Jane Eyre is that she begins to have these feelings, romantic feelings for Mr. Rochester. However, so she is committing, choosing to go forward with this relationship. However, Thornfield Hall is littered with strange happenings like this mysterious laughter that she's hearing. And the housekeeper is really dodging a lot of her questions about this. And she knows maybe there's some kind of dark secret here that they are not telling her. She is still committed to her romance and she's moving forward, even though she is ignoring these secrets that are going to come up later. Next, we have the turning point in Mexican Gothic. So Noemi is at High Place now. She's beginning to suspect that her cousin is not actually suffering from tuberculosis like the family is telling her, this creepy family, but she thinks that something else is going on. Something dangerous is happening at High Place. So at this point, she could still leave High Place, but she chooses to stay and uncover the mystery. So again, she is committing to her story goal to help Catalina, and she is not going to leave. Okay, great. Now we're moving into Act 2. This is the biggest act of your story, and this is where a lot of the fun things are going to happen. So a little bit into your story, into your second act, you're going to get to pinch point 1. This is typically where the central conflict is going to strike again. And this can be an external conflict, internal conflict, or both. Really depends on what your story is. This is just how readers are going to remember that there is a growing threat. And also might be a moment where the protagonist is urged to face their fears, their fatal flaw, their internal conflict, and they are probably not going to be ready to face that just yet. So Jane Eyre, we have this pinch point. It's very sudden when Jane saves Mr. Rochester from this inexplicable fire in his bedroom, deepening their emotional connection. But again, she's puzzled because Mr. Rochester says that the fire was set by this maid, and she doesn't think he's being fully honest with her. So again, she's starting to suspect that something is going on because something did set this fire in the house. She just doesn't know what it is yet. Similarly, in Mexican Gothic, we have Noemi starting to experience these really vivid, what she thinks are dreams that warn her that High Place is a danger, and she starts to sleepwalk. So the external threat here, the conflict, is closing in. Also, Noemi is faced with her fatal flaw when she insults her newest love interest and his feelings are hurt, and she regrets that. So, this is her facing her internal conflict here as well. Both of these things happen around this time. Next up, we have the midpoint. So, we're about halfway through your story now, and I do recommend trying to keep your midpoint relatively close to the halfway point if you can. Three big things are typically going to happen at this point. So first you'll have the stakes will rise. They're going to increase. The tone is going to darken, get more serious. And then the protagonist is going to transition from a reactive to a more proactive role. Also, something that you might have in your story is that you may have a false high or a false low. This is where the story seems to be like trending upward at this point, or conversely, trending downward. And it seems like the protagonist has reached their highest point, or maybe they've reached their lowest point. But of course, we still have half of the story to go, so it's not over yet. The midpoint for Jane Eyre is when Mr. Rochester proposes to Jane and she gladly accepts she's going to finally marry the man that she loves. But it's a false high. It's not actually the end of the story because there's still this underlying tension, this conflict that she is ignoring, and she hasn't uncovered what is going on here causing all this eerie stuff at Thornfield Hall. So she still doesn't know, but she thinks everything is going just peachy. Then we have the midpoint for Mexican Gothic. This is not a false high. It's actually very creepy. So Noemi still refuses to believe in the supernatural, but she's understanding that something airborne is affecting not only Catalina's mental health and physical health, but now Noemi's own health. So she's becoming personally affected. The stakes are raised here. Her life is now on the line. Frances, her love interest, as you can see here, warns her to leave High Place before she gets hurt, killed, though he still isn't telling her what the true antagonist is or what it wants from her. We have pinch point 2. As we saw in pinch point 1, we have the protagonist meet the conflict again, and this is going to happen again, but it's going to be even stronger this time. And this is going to push the protagonist closer to the final confrontation with the main conflict. So again, as I said, the conflict is going to rear its head here at this point. With Jane Eyre, she finally meets what the conflict or the person behind some of this conflict here. So Jane believes that she's dreaming up this monstrous creature towering above her bed. And when she thinks she wakes up, her wedding veil is torn and her wedding is just around the corner. Mr. Rochester again provides this really weird explanation about his maid being scaring her. And Jane still doesn't quite buy it that it's the maid, but she decides to let the matter go and she continues to prepare for her wedding. Then we have here in Mexican Gothic, Noemi gets in this trance-like sleepwalking, and it's getting worse. She finally gets drawn out of her private bath and goes into Victor's bedroom, where he waits with predatory intentions. She has no proof he's behind anything at all, including her or her cousin's weakening minds and bodies, but she knows she cannot trust him, and she now just wants to get out of High Place. All right, and then we have the turning point. We are ready to turn into Act 3, away from Act 2. This is the point where everything seems to fail, the darkest hour, the lowest point. So the worst possible thing that your protagonist thinks will happen to them finally does happen to them. And this could include perhaps uncovering the darkest part of a mystery. It might be making a crucial discovery that's finally unraveled, or maybe even a plot twist. This can be a really good place for a plot twist to finally happen. In Jane Eyre, it is her wedding day, but then she discovers that Mr. Rochester's big secret is coming out. He has a first wife, Bertha Mason, who he keeps hidden in Thornfield Hall because of her dangerous mental illness to protect his wife and to protect others. So this is his legal wife. He's already married. And Jane is devastated by this betrayal. So she decides to leave Thornfield Hall forever. She chooses her moral integrity over her love of him. So she was so happy. It was her wedding day. This thing happens. She is now at the lowest point ever. She has lost the man that she loves forever, or so she thinks. And similarly, Noemi tries to escape from High Place with her cousin Catalina, but then at the last moment, always at the last moment, she is trapped physically by the cruel family's supernatural abilities. They plan to use Noemi as a living host for the forced insemination of their supernatural rebirth. That's a big sentence, but basically, they are immortal beings, and the way that they keep coming back is they keep having these women rebirth them against their will so that they can live forever. Nasty stuff. With the estate's fungus, they have been poisoning her into submission all along, and now she fears she will never be able to escape with her cousin. And we are going to get into Act 3 now, the last act. So, whether this is a few scenes or one scene or one big moment, you're going to have your writer have a crisis. This is the big emotional payoff from the start of the story to the end, because readers want to see how your protagonist is going to change. How have they been forced into change by all of this mounting conflict? They're going to face a crucial decision. Will the protagonist succumb to their fears, or are they going to rise against their greatest conflict? Which one is it going to be? This might feel like an aha moment, depending on the genre. This might feel a little bit more obvious in some stories than in others. And then the protagonist is going to dig deep down, probably, to uncover the lesson of the story, the secret to defeating the villain. They're going to see how their fatal flaw has been holding them back this entire time. And again, as I mentioned, this is the big payoff. So they're proving how they have changed throughout the story. The crisis moment here in Jane Eyre is that we have a couple chapters here. So she flees Thornfield Hall and finds refuge with this kind clergyman, St. John, and his wonderful sisters. Then, miraculously, she gets a huge fortune, and so she finally has independence. Yay, yay for Jane. And things seem to be going well, but then St. John asks her to marry him, and she nearly accepts because he's a safe option, even if she doesn't love him, until she hears Mr. Rochester's voice calling out to her in a supernatural manner. So he's calling her name, or so she thinks. She debates accepting the proposal from St. John or going to see if Mr. Rochester is well. What is she going to do? This is her crisis. What does she value most? We're going to find out. And then here in Mexican Gothic, similarly, Noemi is struggling under Victor's brainwashing, growing weaker and weaker every second. He's about to take over her mind forever, as far as we know. However, her crisis here is, though, as much as she hates Victor and having, her autonomy taken over, his power is starting to appeal to her greed and in her impulsivity. So she is facing a similar crisis moment as well. What is she going to choose? And next we have the big climax, and this is really fun. This can be either one scene or it can be several scenes, and it's going to be the final decisive confrontation between the protagonist and whatever their primary conflict is. The protagonist will either achieve their primary story goal or not. So we'll get the answer to the question we've had since the beginning of Act 2, finally at the end of the climax scene or cluster of scenes. So what could this include? Well, it could be defeating the villain, again, either now or forever. It could also be overcoming their inner conflict at last, finding true love at last. And often there's going to be a lot of fanfare here. So gore, big violence, flashy action, all the bells and whistles. You can go ahead and bring them out for this big send-off. In Jane Eyre, the climax is when Jane chooses to go turn down her proposal and go after Mr. Rochester and see if he's okay. But she's shocked to find Thornfield Hall is burned down. Bertha Mason, this hidden wife, is now dead from a suicide and from setting the building ablaze. And Mr. Rochester is also sadly now blind and disabled for trying to save his wife when she was on the top of Thornfield Hall, about to jump off. So Jane then finds Mr. Rochester. He's still unmarried, he's still in love with her, and she finally agrees to marry him, finally balancing her sense of self-worth and independence with her love for him. So we have this big moment. It's not necessarily, we don't get to see the building catch fire, but still, this is the climax moment where readers are at their highest moment of tension, wondering what is going to happen. Same thing here with Mexican Gothic. So at last, Noemi breaks free of Victor's mental hold on her, and she burns down High Place, defeating Victor and the supernatural threat. So Noemi, Catalina, and Francis all finally escape. At last, she has saved her cousin, she's found a worthy lover, and she's overcome her external and internal conflict. All right, everybody, now we have reached the resolution. This is the last part of your story, but also very important part. So what happens is you're going to tie up all the loose ends of your story, or as I said, most of the loose ends of your story. You might leave some things untied because readers do like a lingering sense of ambiguity or unease with a Gothic fiction story, as we talked about earlier. And then I've said here, even if the ending is happily ever after, the characters rarely emerge physically or emotionally undamaged. And we're going to see that in both of these examples. So in Jane Eyre, the good news is that 10 years later, she's so happy in her marriage with Mr. Rochester, who actually has regained some of his sight in one of his eyes. They have a son together. Also, the Sisters of St. John like to visit her often, which she loves, and she and St. John have remained on good terms. However, sadly, I don't know why I laughed. It is sad. St. John is actually going to die from overworking himself, as we learn at the very end. And also, Mr. Rochester is still disabled. When he tried to help Bertha Mason, he ended up losing, I believe, one of his arms. So he is still going to be, physically hurt for the rest of his life. And as we can see, neither of them emerged unscathed at the end of this story. Next, we have the resolution here for Mexican Gothic. So we know Noemi, Catalina, and Francis are all safe for now, and Noemi and Francis can finally be in love together. However, the bad news is that Noemi cannot be sure she or Francis are ever truly going to escape the influence of High Place because they were there for so long, breathing in this fungus airborne thing that has messed with their minds. They don't know. The threat may return. They may have limited time together. So we're left with this feeling of like, okay, things are good, but only for now. We don't know what the future is going to hold. And voila, that is all of the major plot points for our 3-act outline of the Gothic novel. Thank you all for bearing with me there. So you're going to be leaving this webinar with, again, I hope an understanding of the Gothic genre conventions and characteristics. We talked about how to outline your own Gothic novel with each of these plot points, and we also looked at both Jane Eyre and Mexican Gothic as examples. I also want to mention, if you would like to work with me on your story, if you have a manuscript that you would like to be evaluated and polished for publication, I would love to hear about your story, whether it is a genre, a Gothic fiction story or another genre. I would still love to hear about it. So please reach out to me and I'm happy to give you a 10% off as well. Okay, and now we have reached Q&A. Just before we jump into questions, I want to say one more time here. I think the link is either going to be dropped in the chat or it already has for the 3-act outline workbook that I have created. If you would like to plot your own story on these plot points, I recommend using that. It really breaks it down easily for you. Okay. And great, that is now time for Q&A. Thank you, everybody. All right, and let me pull up my questions here. Okay, so first question. Yes, thank you. Thank you all for coming. How do you make Gothic romance in the first place? Great topic. Okay, how do you write a Gothic story with a romance perhaps as the primary plot? This question was sent in 2016, so this was a little bit before we started to talk about the plot for Jane Eyre. But basically, I'll just recap. If you want to write a Gothic story with the romance as the primary plot, you absolutely can do so. That just means that you're going to be writing a love story. So you're going to be using a lot of the same conventions and plot points that you'd see in a romance, but it's going to be probably a little darker. There's going to be more drama and conflict. If you have any other specific questions to ask me about this, please do. But I do recommend reading Jane Eyre is a good Gothic romance to get started with. And again, yes, thank you, everybody. Yay, I'm so glad it was helpful. Okay, the next question here. How do you know if your story is too similar? How do you know if your story is too similar to something already out there, especially a story still copyrighted? Sure. Setting, including setting, descriptions, plot, percentages, and how you measure. Okay, this happens all the time. As I will tell writers, you think of any idea, you're going to find it done at least once, if not like 20 times, 100 times before. What is important is that you write a story with an idea that you like, and then the execution, that is the part that is going to be, that's the original part of your story. So as long as your execution is different from that story, it's fine. You can still write that book. You don't want to have characters with the same names or keep the same title, right? But you can still write your story idea, even if it's been taken by someone else. Also, you can write a retelling. I wrote an article about this for Jane Friedman's site, which I'm happy to share as well. Sorry, my voice is getting so weak after all this talking. If you would like to write a retelling, you just have to make sure that you are legally adapting a story that is in the commons for use. So we can talk about that more. I'm happy to share that link as well if you'd like to write a retelling. Next up, we have this question. Can you add a sprinkle of horror to sci-fi web series or story? A sprinkle of horror. Sure. I'm not sure exactly what your sprinkle might be. I mean, are there characteristics from the horror genre, specifically like Gothic horror, that you can use in sci-fi stories? Absolutely. I mean, if your story's genre is primarily like a sci-fi action flick, you want to make sure you're delivering on those genre conventions first. And yeah, I think you can add in elements of horror, mystery, the grotesque, if that works for your story and for your audience, absolutely. All right, next question we have, do you think an invitation to go somewhere spooky without dire stakes, at least as far as the protagonist knows, do you think that counts or could be an effective inciting incident? Yes, I do, absolutely. Or would it be first encountering a monster in that place? Yes, I would say that is probably encountering the monster because I'm assuming that the monster or the antagonist, the villain, whatever it is the one who sent that invitation, right? So you're not directly having the protagonist meet the antagonist right then, but they are still meeting. So yes, I would say that probably counts first as an inciting incident and also as the first encounter of conflict with your primary conflict in the story. Yes. Okay. Moving right along, we have how clear should you make your villain? Is it okay to have the antagonist and protagonist blur? Absolutely. God, that's so fun. So this can be, there's so many good examples of this. If you have a protagonist who's also the antagonist, maybe they don't know that they're the antagonist yet. That's a wonderful way to write a story. So you're getting into unreliable narrators. You might want to look at how to write some of those. What's a good one? Like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Actually, haven't read that, but I think that that's kind of similar to what you're talking about. Potentially, how clear should you make your villain is sort of a different question. If you want it to be a surprise, like an unraveling of the truth that the antagonist and the protagonist are the same, then yeah, I think you can have this slowly hinted at throughout the story, and then you have the big reveal towards the end. That works great. That's an exciting story. You just want to make sure that all of your hints, your clues of who the true villain is, are planted and grounded in the story before you get to that reveal, so that it doesn't feel like you're cheating the reader. Okay, and then we have, I think, time for one more question here. So, last one. My current work in progress is a blend of Gothic horror and neo-noir. How would you recommend going about combining the flowery, extensive descriptions of Gothic with the sparse style of noir? Yeah, that does seem, I don't know. I'd have to read a little bit, but I think you can definitely do it. I think you can have a more sparse description and it still count as Gothic. So if you don't want to go ahead and go into these really extensive, as you say, flowery descriptions, I don't think you have to. As long as we're getting this feeling of, isolation, probably with the setting and a feeling of darkness, or um, the the setting is falling apart, so we understand it's dilapidated. I think that you're going to be able to convey all the important aspects of that. Okay, and I think we have reached all of the questions. If there's anything I didn't answer, no? Okay, great.
All right. Thank you so much, Hannah. This was wonderful. Thank you to everybody who came today. And we have another session starting in just an hour. So you can check back on the hub a little bit later, and we should have the replay and transcript and everything up there for you to watch at your leisure. So thanks all, and we will see you soon. Bye,
Thanks.
everyone.
Bye.